London, England, the early 1900s. The streets were crowded with smoke, noise, and the endless rhythm of survival. In the working-class neighborhoods of North London, children learned early that life was not gentle. Families struggled to keep food on the table. Dreams were considered luxuries. And for a young girl, Gladys Aylward, the future seemed painfully ordinary. She was born into a poor family in 1902. Her father worked as a postman. There was no wealth, no social status, no remarkable opportunity waiting for her. She was small in stature, quiet in appearance, and academically unimpressive. Teachers did not expect greatness from her. In fact, most people barely noticed her at all. By the age when many children still imagined grand futures, Gladys had already stepped into hard labor. She became a housemaid, scrubbing floors, polishing furniture, washing dishes, and serving wealthy families whose lives looked nothing like hers. Day after day she moved silently through elegant homes while carrying the invisible weight of a life that seemed destined to remain small. Yet something inside her refused to settle. There was a hunger in her spirit that no ordinary routine could satisfy. At first, she did not fully understand it herself. Then one evening, everything changed. Gladys attended a church service where the preacher spoke about surrendering one's life completely to God. The words struck her heart with unusual force. It was as though heaven itself had interrupted her ordinary existence. That night, she became convinced that her life belonged to something greater than comfort, money, or social approval. And then came the thought that would completely alter the course of her future: China. Halfway across the world, millions of people had never heard the gospel. The more Gladys learned about the nation, the more she became consumed by a deep and undeniable conviction that God was calling her there. It sounded impossible. She had no money, no education, no connections, no training, and absolutely no qualifications that would make anyone think she could survive in a foreign nation. For political unrest, cultural barriers, and dangerous travel conditions. But the call would not leave her, so she did what many aspiring missionaries did in those days. She applied to the China Inland Mission, one of the largest missionary organizations serving China at the time. To Gladys, this was the answer. Surely if God had called her, the mission board would recognize it too. Surely they would help her get there. At first, things appeared hopeful. She was accepted into a short preparatory course where future missionaries trained for service overseas. But very quickly, problems began to surface. The greatest obstacle was language. Chinese was considered one of the most difficult languages in the world to learn, and Gladys struggled terribly. She tried desperately to keep up with the lessons, but she fell behind again and again. The instructors became increasingly concerned. Other students advanced, while she remained stuck. Eventually, the verdict came. She was rejected. The mission board concluded that she simply was not capable enough for the field. She lacked the educational background necessary to learn the language properly. To them, sending her to China would be irresponsible. In simple terms, they believed she would fail. Imagine the crushing weight of that moment. The very people who supposedly existed to send missionaries into the world had looked directly at Gladys Aylward and said, "You are not enough, too uneducated, too incapable, too unlikely." And though history would later celebrate her faith, at that moment there was nothing glamorous about her rejection. She returned to her ordinary work carrying disappointment heavy in her heart. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. But not for Gladys, because there is something powerful about a person who becomes absolutely convinced that God has spoken. The opinions of experts lose their final authority. The barriers begin to look temporary, and rejection becomes fuel instead of defeat. Gladys continued working as a maid, but now every coin she earned carried purpose. While others spent money on entertainment or comfort, she quietly saved every possible penny. She lived with astonishing discipline because she believed China still waited for her. At times, even those closest to her thought she was unrealistic. How could a poor housemaid travel across continents alone? How could an uneducated woman survive in rural China? How could someone rejected by missionary experts suddenly succeed on her own? The question sounded reasonable, but Gladys had already settled something in her heart. If God truly called her, then human approval could not be the final gatekeeper. Years passed, the dream refused to die. Then one day, Gladys heard about an elderly missionary woman named Jeannie Lawson who lived in a remote region of China. Lawson needed help running a small inn for travelers. The opportunity immediately captured Gladys' attention. This was the opening she had prayed for. There was just one problem. Traveling to China required money she still did not have. Yet instead of surrendering the dream again, Gladys worked even harder. She cleaned houses, took difficult jobs, denied herself comforts. Slowly, painfully, she gathered enough money for the cheapest route possible to China. The journey itself was terrifying. She could not afford a luxurious voyage by sea. Instead, she purchased a ticket that would take her across Europe and through Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railway, one of the most dangerous routes available during a time of severe political tension and conflict between Russia and China. Think about the magnitude of what she was attempting. A small English woman with little education was preparing to cross continents alone into unfamiliar territory because she believed God had called her. No mission board supported her. No wealthy sponsor financed her. No safety net guaranteed her survival. All she had was conviction, and sometimes conviction is the only bridge between an ordinary life and an extraordinary destiny. As Gladys packed her few belongings, many people still doubted her chances. Some likely assumed she would eventually come home defeated. Others probably thought reality would crush her idealism before she ever reached China. But heaven saw something nobody else recognized. The world saw weakness, God saw endurance. The world saw limitation, God saw obedience. The world saw a rejected servant girl. God saw the answer 2 years of prayer waiting on the other side of the world. ***. What Gladys did not yet realize was that China itself was about to enter one of the darkest and most violent periods in its modern history. War clouds were forming. Political instability was rising. Entire regions would soon descend into chaos. And directly in the middle of that coming storm, a tiny woman from London was being sent into history. The train tracks ahead of her stretched across frozen lands, hostile borders, and impossible uncertainty. But they also stretched toward destiny. And in the next chapter of Gladys Aylward's story, the rejected maid who was told she could never become a missionary would begin the dangerous journey that changed countless lives forever. The winter air cut through Gladys Aylward's thin clothing as she stepped onto the train platform with a single suitcase, limited money, and a determination stronger than fear itself. Behind her was England, the only home she had ever known. Ahead of her stretched thousands of miles of uncertainty. Most people would have called the decision reckless. A poor housemaid traveling alone across continents toward a dangerous nation sounded almost unbelievable. Yet Gladys believed she was obeying God, and that conviction carried her forward when logic warned her to turn back. The Trans-Siberian Railway was not a comfortable adventure. The route crossed freezing landscapes, hostile territories, and regions shaken by political unrest. Every station brought unfamiliar languages, suspicious faces, and the constant awareness that she was completely alone. Unlike wealthy travelers, surrounded by security and resources, Gladys traveled in cramped conditions among strangers, carrying barely enough money to survive the trip. Still, she pressed onward. As the train thundered across Europe and deeper into Russia, fear often whispered against her faith. She had never experienced such isolation before. At times, she likely wondered whether the mission board had been right all along. What if she truly was unprepared? What if this journey ended in disaster? Yet whenever doubt tried to overwhelm her, the calling in her spirit remained stronger. Then the danger became real. While traveling through Soviet territory, Gladys discovered that conflict between Russia and China had disrupted parts of the railway system. Military tensions had intensified, and foreigners traveling alone suddenly faced serious risks. Confusion spread among passengers, instructions changed rapidly. Authorities became suspicious of outsiders. Before long, Gladys found herself trapped in a frightening situation with little understanding of what to do next. At one point, she was ordered off the train and became stranded in a remote area with almost no ability to communicate. Imagine the terror of that moment. She was a small English woman in unfamiliar territory during political conflict, unable to speak the language fluently, carrying almost no resources, and separated from everything familiar. Many travelers would have surrendered immediately, but Gladys refused to quit. She prayed constantly through the ordeal. Every step forward depended upon courage she did not naturally possess. Somehow, through a chain of unexpected help, directions, and narrow escapes, she managed to continue the journey. She crossed dangerous regions, endured exhausting travel conditions, and eventually found passage that brought her closer to China. What should have destroyed her instead strengthened her resolve. Finally, after weeks of hardship, Gladys arrived in Yongcheng, a remote mountain town in northern China. There she met Jeannie Lawson, the elderly missionary who had opened the door for her arrival. The contrast between the women was striking. Lawson was older, experienced, and already seasoned by years of missionary work. Gladys was inexperienced, unknown, and still recovering from the brutal journey. Yet despite their differences, the two women shared one common burden. They wanted the people of China to know Christ. Together they operated a small inn called the Innovate Happinesses, named after the Beatitudes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The inn served mule drivers and travelers crossing dangerous mountain roads. At night, exhausted men crowded into the building seeking food, warmth, and rest after difficult journeys. For Gladys and Lawson, the inn was more than a business. It was a mission field, as travelers gathered around meals and fires. The women told Bible stories, shared the gospel, and listened to the struggles of the people around them. Gradually, the inn became known not only as a place of shelter, but also as a place of compassion. But missionary life in China proved far more difficult than Gladys had imagined. The culture was unfamiliar. The language remained challenging. Poverty surrounded her daily. Disease, hardship, and political instability touched nearly every community. Even simple routines required enormous adjustment. Yet instead of retreating into frustration, Gladys immersed herself completely in the lives of the Chinese people. She adopted Chinese clothing, learned local customs, studied the language relentlessly. Slowly, the foreign servant girl began earning trust, and perhaps most remarkably, the people themselves started responding to her message. They saw something genuine in her life. Gladys did not arrive with wealth or superiority. She lived among them, suffered beside them, and served without demanding comfort. Then another unexpected opportunity appeared. Chinese officials were searching for someone willing to work as a foot inspector, helping enforce the government's ban against the ancient practice of foot binding. For centuries, young girls' feet had been tightly bound to keep them unnaturally small, causing lifelong pain and disability. The government wanted the cruel practice stopped, but many regions resisted change. Amazingly, Gladys accepted the assignment. Think about how extraordinary this was. The woman once rejected for lacking education was now traveling through villages as an official representative carrying government authority. She entered homes, spoke with families, and advocated for vulnerable young girls who could not defend themselves. Her courage astonished people. She crossed mountain paths alone, visited dangerous areas, settled disputes, shared scripture, prayed for the sick, and everywhere she traveled, her reputation grew. The people who once viewed her as a foreign outsider slowly began calling her Aylward, the Chinese pronunciation of Aylward. It was more than a name. It symbolized acceptance. Yet even as Gladys finally began finding her place in China, darkness was approaching rapidly. Japan's military expansion across China was intensifying. Entire cities faced invasion. Violence spread through the nation with terrifying speed. Rumors of war reached even remote mountain villages. Fear settled heavily over the people And soon, Gladys Aylward would face the greatest test of her life. The tiny missionary, rejected by experts, was about to step directly into the horrors of war. Within months, impossible choices, starving children, and advancing soldiers would force Gladys into a mission far greater than preaching sermons. The servant girl from London would become guide. And evidence God chooses people. By the late 1930s, China had become a nation drowning in violence. The Japanese invasion spread terror across city after city, leaving behind destruction, starvation, and fear. Entire communities collapsed under the weight of war. Families were separated overnight, villages burned. Refugees flooded the roads carrying whatever little they could salvage from ruined homes. Everywhere Gladys Aylward looked, suffering seemed endless. Yet instead of fleeing from danger, she moved toward it. The little missionary, once dismissed as too weak and unqualified, now traveled directly through regions many others considered hopelessly unsafe. She comforted wounded civilians, prayed with grieving families, and helped refugees however she could. The people trusted her because they knew she genuinely loved them. She was no longer merely a visitor from England. China had become her home. Then war arrived violently at Yongcheng itself. Japanese aircraft roared across the skies. Bombs exploded in nearby areas. Panic swept through the town as civilians scrambled desperately for safety. The peaceful rhythms of village life vanished almost overnight. Fear now governed daily existence. One day, while chaos consumed the region, Gladys witnessed wounded soldiers and terrified civilians pouring into the area. The destruction horrified her. Bodies lay broken. Children cried for parents they could not find. Entire families wandered homeless and starving. And still, she refused to abandon the people. During one terrifying attack, Gladys personally helped rescue injured victims, despite enormous danger to herself. She moved through areas threatened by bombing and gunfire, carrying the wounded to safety. Witnesses later described her astonishing calm under pressure. The woman who once doubted her own abilities now displayed extraordinary courage in the middle of war. But the greatest challenge was still ahead. As violence intensified, orphaned children began appearing everywhere. Some had watched their parents die. Others had become separated during bombings or evacuations. Many wandered hungry, frightened, and completely alone. Gladys could not ignore them. One child became 2, became 10. Soon dozens of children depended upon her for food, shelter, and protection. Somehow she found ways to care for them, despite having almost no resources herself. She begged for supplies, stretched every scrap of food, and trusted God daily for provision. But conditions kept worsening. Japanese forces advanced steadily through the region. Entire towns faced occupation. Rumors spread of brutal massacres in conquered areas. Refugees fled constantly through the mountains, searching for any place of safety. Then came the crisis that would define Gladys Aylward's legacy forever. Government officials informed her that the children under her care had to be evacuated immediately. Remaining in the region meant almost certain death, but moving them to safety required crossing dangerous mountains, traveling through war zones, and navigating impossible terrain. The responsibility was overwhelming. Gladys was exhausted, malnourished, and physically weak. Years of hard missionary work and wartime stress had already damaged her health. Yet more than 100 orphan children now depended entirely upon her leadership. There was no backup plan, no military escort, no organized rescue team, just one tiny missionary woman and a massive group of frightened children trapped in a collapsing war zone. Many people would have considered the situation hopeless. Gladys chose faith instead, gathering the children together. She prepared them for a journey that would test every ounce of their endurance. They would travel on foot through mountains towards safety hundreds of miles away. Food was scarce, the roads were dangerous. Japanese patrols threatened many routes. At any moment they could be discovered, attacked, or stranded without supplies. Still, they began walking. Imagine the scene. A small woman leading more than 100 children through wartime China. Some children were weak from hunger. Some were sick. Some were so traumatized They barely spoke, yet day after day Gladys pushed them forward. Across rivers, through mountains, along narrow paths, into freezing nights and uncertain mornings. The journey became a living picture of courage under impossible pressure. Food often ran dangerously low. Gladys gave away portions of her own meals to feed the children. At times exhaustion nearly crushed her physically, yet whenever despair threatened the group, she kept encouraging them to continue. One story from the journey became especially famous. At a terrifying river crossing, the children grew overwhelmed with fear. The water appeared dangerous, and many believed they would die trying to cross. Panic spread rapidly among them, seeing their terror. Gladys remembered the biblical story of Moses leading Israel through the Red Sea. She reminded the children that God had helped his people before and could help them again. One little girl looked at Gladys and asked, "But where is your Moses?" The question pierced deeply because Gladys herself felt completely inadequate. Finally, she answered softly, "There is no Moses, but God is still God." That simple statement revealed the true foundation of her strength. Gladys never believed she was extraordinary. She knew her own weakness, knew her fears, knew her limitations, but she also believed God could work through ordinary obedience in extraordinary situations. And somehow, step by step, the group survived. After an exhausting journey filled with danger, starvation, sickness, and emotional strain, Gladys successfully led the children to safety in Xi'an. Against all odds, the rejected missionary had rescued over 100 orphans from the horrors of war. But the journey came at tremendous personal cost. By the time they reached safety, Gladys was physically shattered. Years of relentless service combined with the trauma of war had devastated her health. She collapsed from exhaustion and illness soon afterward. The woman who had spent herself saving others now lay weak and broken. Yet even then, her story was only beginning to spread. News of the tiny missionary who rescued orphaned children through war-torn China began capturing international attention. Journalists, churches, and supporters around the world struggled to comprehend the scale of what she had accomplished. And perhaps what made the story so powerful was this: she had done it without the qualifications everyone once considered essential. The mission board that rejected her could never have predicted this future. The teachers who underestimated her could never have imagined these moments. The world had measured Gladys Aylward by education, appearance, and social standing. God measured her by willingness, and through that willingness, countless lives were saved. But even after surviving war, Gladys Aylward's mission in China was far from over. Greater heartbreak, deeper sacrifice, and an even larger legacy still waited ahead, because the woman once called too small for God's work was about to become one of the most beloved missionaries in modern Christian history. When Gladys Aylward finally collapsed from exhaustion after leading more than 100 orphan children to safety, her body had reached its limit. Years of hardship had drained her strength. The war had scarred her emotionally. Malnutrition and illness had weakened her physically. And yet, despite everything she endured, her spirit remained unbroken. News of her rescue mission spread rapidly beyond China. Newspapers and Christian organizations began telling the remarkable story of the tiny English missionary who crossed mountains during wartime to save abandoned children. To many people around the world, Gladys Aylward suddenly became a symbol of extraordinary courage. But what made her story so powerful was not merely what she accomplished. It was who she had been before it all began. She was the woman rejected by the experts, the servant girl with little education, the missionary candidate considered unqualified, the person nearly everyone underestimated. And now the same woman stood as living evidence that human limitations do not restrict what God can do through surrendered lives. Still, Gladys herself never sought fame. In fact, attention often embarrassed her. She did not view herself as a hero. Those who knew her personally described her as humble, deeply compassionate, and intensely focused on serving others rather than building a reputation. Even after surviving one of the most extraordinary missionary stories of the 20th century, She remained remarkably simple in spirit, eventually. Because of political instability and the growing dangers surrounding foreign missionaries in China, Gladys was forced to leave the country she loved so deeply. The Communist Revolution transformed the nation dramatically, and conditions became increasingly hostile toward Christian missionary work. Leaving China broke her heart. This was not simply a location where she had worked. It was home. The people were her family. The children were her own, in every way except blood. Yet, once again, Gladys faced painful uncertainty. Many people in her position might have retired quietly after enduring war, illness, and decades of sacrifice. She had already given more than most people could imagine. But Gladys Aylward was not finished serving. She eventually settled in Taiwan, where she continued working with orphaned and vulnerable children for many more years. Even after international recognition made her famous, she returned to the same kind of humble service that had defined her entire life. That consistency says something profound about her character. Some people rise during moments of crisis, but lose themselves when recognition arrives. Gladys remained the same. She still loved children, still preached the gospel, still sacrificed comfort for the needs of others, still trusted God daily. And perhaps that steady faithfulness became one of the greatest testimonies of her life. As her story spread across the world, books and films introduced millions to her incredible journey. One of the most famous adaptations was the 1958 movie The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, starring Ingrid Bergman as Gladys Aylward. The film brought global attention to her missionary work and inspired countless people with her courage and perseverance. Yet even Hollywood could not fully capture the depth of what made her story extraordinary, because at its core, Gladys Aylward's life was not really about adventure. It was about obedience. Think about it carefully. What if Gladys had accepted the mission board's rejection as final? What if she had allowed embarrassment to silence her calling? What if fear had stopped her from boarding that train? What if exhaustion had caused her to abandon those children during the war? History would have lost one of its most remarkable testimonies of courage and faith. More importantly, countless lives would have been forever changed. This is what makes her story timeless. The world constantly measures people according to outward qualifications, education, status, appearance, influence, talent, connections, ***. But again and again throughout history, God has chosen unlikely people to accomplish extraordinary things. A shepherd boy defeats a giant, a stuttering man confronts Pharaoh, fishermen become apostles, and a rejected housemaid becomes the answer 2 years of prayer in China. Gladys Aylward's life confronts one of humanity's deepest fears, the fear of being inadequate. So many people quietly believe they are too ordinary to matter, too broken, too unknown, too unqualified, too late, too weak. But Gladys' story stands as a contradiction to all those assumptions. She never became powerful by the world's standards. She never gained advanced theological education. She never possessed natural charisma or commanding presence. Even physically, she remained tiny and unimpressive. Yet heaven saw something the world overlooked: availability. And availability in the hands of God became more powerful than human credentials. There is another reason her story continues touching hearts decades after her death. Gladys did not merely preach compassion, she lived it. When children were starving, she fed them. When refugees suffered, she helped them. When fear consumed villages, she stayed beside the people instead of protecting herself. Her Christianity was not abstract philosophy. It was sacrificial love in action, and perhaps that is why the Chinese people trusted her so deeply. They saw authenticity. She did not come to dominate them culturally or elevate herself above them. She learned their language, embraced their customs, and genuinely cared for their lives. That kind of love leaves permanent impact. Gladys Aylward eventually died in 1970 in Taiwan after decades of service. But death did not silence her legacy. Even now, her story continues inspiring missionaries, pastors, teachers, parents, and ordinary believers around the world. Countless people have found courage through her example during seasons when they felt overlooked or incapable. Because her life whispers an unforgettable truth. Your limitations do not intimidate God. The world may reject you. Experts may underestimate you. Opportunities may close. People may decide you are not enough. But human rejection is not heaven's final verdict. Gladys Aylward proved that one surrendered life can influence generations. And maybe the most astonishing part of her story is this: when she first dreamed of going to China, almost nobody believed she could succeed. Yet somewhere across the world, there were children she had not met yet who would one day depend entirely upon her courage. There were villages waiting for hope. There were prayers rising to heaven for a help that had not arrived yet. And the answer to those prayers came through a woman the world nearly dismissed completely. A woman too old, too small, too uneducated, yet chosen anyway. And perhaps that is exactly why her story still matters today. Gladys Aylward's story is more than history. It is a powerful reminder that God often chooses the people the world overlooks. She began life as an ordinary servant girl with little education, no influence, and countless reasons to give up. Rejected by those who believed she would never succeed, she still chose obedience over fear. And through that obedience, she crossed continents, survived war, rescued children, and became a light in one of history's darkest moments. Her life proves that courage is not the absence of weakness, but the decision to move forward despite it. The same woman once told she was not enough became the answer to prayers she never even heard. And maybe that is the message we all need to remember. Your limitations do not define your destiny. If this story inspired you, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this story with others, and drop a comment below telling us what part of Gladys Aylward's journey impacted you the most.